Hi, this is John Goodman. Today we are talking about a phrase, the phrase earnest money going hard, that causes a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of hard feelings, a lot of mischief in the real estate world. So we're trying to define what does going hard mean, and I'm building up to something. And what I'm building up to is I think it's a good idea. I think it's perfectly acceptable to use that phrase going hard as we talk in verbal conversations. I think it's fine to use it in emails. I think it's fine to use it in letters of intent. However, my premise for this webcast is that it is a clause that is not sufficiently precise. It means different things to different people. So you should not use the phrase earnest money goes hard in a contract. Don't use it in a contract. Okay, here's why. Let's explore what some people think it means. So I've had clients who were sellers under a contract. The seller had a contract where the buyer's earnest money was supposed to go hard by a certain date. That date came and went, and then after that date, my seller client failed to perform on some obligation under the contract. The seller failed to provide documents that the seller was supposed to provide. The seller failed to obtain an easement that the seller was supposed to provide. The seller failed to replace the roof the way the seller was obligated to under the contract. And my seller client still thought they got to keep the buyer's earnest money because, after all, the buyer's earnest money goes hard. No, that's not what it means. It does not mean that, notwithstanding the seller's default, the seller gets to keep the buyer's earnest money. No, that's not what it means. I've had other clients think, well, what it means is I won't have a hassle getting the earnest money back from the buyer. If the buyer defaults under the contract, if there's not some contingency or other provision that excuses the buyer from performing under the contract, then I will essentially just be able to snap my fingers and get the earnest money back. Is that what earnest money goes hard means? No, that is not what it means. In a very, very high percentage of your transactions, the earnest money will be held by a neutral third party, like a title company or a closer or a lawyer. And that lawyer, that neutral third party, is not going to release the earnest money to the seller unless the buyer acknowledges that there's no controversy about the earnest money. If the buyer is either passive-aggressive and fails to sign off, releasing the earnest money back to the seller, or the buyer comes up with some rationale in their mind for not releasing the earnest money to the seller is going to have a dogfight getting the earnest money back from the buyer. Okay? Some sellers think earnest money goes hard means that after the contract gets past this point in time, let's say time is moving this way, once we get past this go hard date, some sellers think that the earnest money will be released to the seller at that point in time before the transaction closes. No, that's not what it means. If that's what the seller's intention is, that should be written into the contract. Some sellers think earnest money goes hard means that unless there's a contingency in the contract that excuses the buyer from performing, the seller will get the buyer's earnest money. No, that's not what it means. There's lots of ways that a buyer might have an out under a contract regardless of what's stated within the four corners of the contract. Let me give you some examples. In residential real estate, if the meth disclosure protocols are not complied with in Colorado, this is a Colorado example, the contract is void and the buyer would be able to get the buyer's earnest money back. In Colorado, there also happens to be a statute that says regardless of when all the other contingencies in the contract expire, the buyer has a right to test the property for meth, and if the buyer discovers meth over certain levels, the buyer can terminate the contract. Other examples, if the lead-based paint protocols are not complied with. Other examples are if the seller has committed fraud, regardless of what the contract says, the buyer has an out under the buyer has an out because of the seller's fraud. So what earnest money going hard means is about as hard as it can get under the contract is that after a certain date, the buyer no longer has contractual contingencies to get out of the contract and get their earnest money back. That's all it means. If that's the intention of the seller, fantastic. and make sure the contract reads that way. But don't put the phrase earnest money goes hard after a certain date in the contract, because it's lazy and it leads to misunderstandings. All right, we live in a complicated world. Be careful out there.